what would Ireland under People Before Profit look like? What is socialism?
Under us, okay. Well, I think what socialism is quite simple. It's like sharing wealth, So I've been talking about this the last few days because of the budget, obviously. But we have a situation where, like in Britain in 1980, you had, I think it was 15 billionaires. Now there's 165. In the South, there was, depends on what you read, either no billionaires in 1980 or one. And now there's somewhere in the region of around 15. Corporate profits are through the roof, banks, energy companies. So it's about saying that should be democratically controlled and democratically owned.
Which is public ownership.
Public, ideally workers' control, some form of people assemblies, workers' controls, call it what you want. And that everybody has a say in how the economy is run and how society is run. And I think that's very, very democratic at its heart. And if you had to say like, I'm trying to think the date of the French Revolution, 1789, over 200 years ago, that we could have a society not ruled by monarchs, kings and queens, people would have said, you're crazy, that's just off the wall. And I think looking back, I don't know what time period, I think people will think it's crazy that we live in a society that has election. Okay, I know it's a bit more stable in the north, but election every 5 years, and really people don't have any recall power over their politicians. They can do what they want for the most part in Stormont or Westminster, and there's a lack of democracy in our society. So socialism is about giving people hope, extension of democracy, hopefully ending this crazy drive to militarisation and war, and really about putting faith in ordinary working class people, which I think quite often a lot of our politicians and general establishment media don't.
There are 20 directions I could go there, and I've tried to write down very, very quickly. So in terms of you describe the economy and the democratic control of the economy, public ownership of the economy. Some people would say state control of the economy. So what would not be controlled by the state in terms of the economy?
Well, I mean, that's up for discussion, but I'm not proposing to nationalise corner shops, you know what I mean? And that's not in our manifesto. So I think quite often that can be worked out, because obviously I think it's important to have a general vision of where we can go in terms of socialist society, but it needs to be democratically discussed. So we're not going to pontificate about everything that can be done. I've got certain ideas, of course, but I think these things have to be worked out collectively and democratically, which I think separates socialists, people who profit from quite often other parties, which is very much, it has to be this way. So we have a general view on things, but I think it has to be democratically decided by workers, by young people, by people who are sort of ground down by capitalism. And that's the other thing, Ciarán, left its own devices, we are snookered on our capitalism. We're snookered, climate change, the drive to war, and I don't trust the people in charge. I mean, they couldn't really, in a global sense I'm talking about here, couldn't protect people for the most part during a pandemic. I don't trust them to save people, to protect people during a climate disaster. So I think we have to have a completely new system, and I think there's growing appetite for that. Across the world, you see the Mandani stuff. You see stuff in Britain. Obviously, it's not clear cut in terms of your party, but there's an appetite for left politics, radical politics, and that gives me hope for the future.
Well, you seem very hopeful, because sometimes we're talking about very small percentages here.
Absolutely, but you have to not forget that there's been a decades-long campaign against sort of left-wing socialist ideas, in Britain, Ireland, USA, and elsewhere. And even still, you have, popular support. I mean, the belly of the beast, New York, where obviously the New York Stock Exchange is, where it's the ideological centre for sort of US, if not world capitalism. And you had a socialist elected, you know what I mean? Despite all the crying about him being a communist and all the other sort of nasty stuff from Trump. So that shows that the socialist ideas are popular. It's not inevitable that socialist ideas can win, but I think we're in an era where people are just fed up with the system, fed up with huge rents, fed up with being taken advantage of by the system. And I think in that context, I hope we can grow, but socialist politics more generally can grow.
You see, the thing is, I think that everybody wants socialism for the people above them, but not so much for the people below them. For example, if you speak to working class people, for example, many working class people may believe in class warfare, but they believe in class warfare prosecuted against the people below them as well. For example, the white van man. If you go and speak to the white van man, and he might be a single trader, he might sell something, he might do something, he's got a trade. I don't hear socialist politics from them, because what I hear from people, and I'm drawing a huge, I'm just taking my paintbrush out here.
Yeah.
I mean, they're very annoyed. They say, you're a journalist. What about these social mobility cars? what about those in benefits? What about those lazy people? So, I mean, now you can say, well, that's the product of a 20-year campaign against people, and, but they might say, well, you're for the workers or you're for welfare.
Yeah, and I think obviously that's, it's broad brushes are you're painting people, but there's an element of truth in terms of different sort of maybe categories of people or workers or whatever. But it's not insurmountable. I think people can be the vast majority of people can be won to different positions. People aren't fixed. I mean, it's in the general sense of sort of even the national question here for the most part, but people aren't fixed in the positions that they articulate, they repeat, or they say, and people can quite often have contradictory ideas where they could maybe say something about, not being supportive of people on benefits, but then they may be on benefits themselves. You know what I mean? In terms of like universal credit or working tax credits.
Well, I mean, that's the hypocrisy behind a lot of things. I mean, there are people who would be telling you this, and I might know, well, actually, you know what I mean, you're either on benefits yourself or brought up in a house in which people were dependent on benefits. But that's the hypocrisy of mankind.
Well, not really. I'd say it's kind of what you said. It's the 20, if not longer year, denigration of benefits. You know what I mean? By, not all, but most sort of mainstream, British way media outlets. So that has a trickle down effect on people, and even immigration. You have people kind of saying contradictory things. They may say, "Oh, the country's full up," or "We can't do this, we can't do that. Look after our own," and all this kind of stuff. And then you go like, "But do you have any family members in Australia or America?" And they go, "Oh, that's different." So I think things are quite.
But you hear that all the time, clearly. You're talking to people on the ground. You must hear. Like, I mean, that's one of the questions. I mean, working class people. You say it's growing, but working class people tend not to vote for socialism, and like you're out there trying to sell socialism to working class people. And it must be, you're a very positive person, but it must be slightly disheartening when people throw it back in your face.
Well, I mean, I don't think they have in a sense. I mean, obviously, like I've been elected rep for, almost 12 years now. And obviously we've went, some elections you've taken a hit, some elections you've kind of grown your vote, but I've remained. We've Councillor Michael Collins in West Belfast, Councillor in Derry, and obviously people in the south. So obviously you always want more, you want to grow your project, but I don't think people have fully rejected us. I don't think that's fair, and I think people have respect for what we do collectively in terms of our on the ground campaign around Palestine, around other issues, but also I think there's a belief in there needs to be a different kind of society, whether those people are fully grown socialists or not, obviously remains to be seen. But I think there's certainly an audience for that, and that's something that I think we can develop in the next 2 years, 3 years. I
mean, people talk about different societies, and I talk an awful lot. I do hear people talking about an awful lot of different society. Obviously, I hear people on the right, and they believe in a different society. They believe that some strong man will naturally come forward and rule. I hear people in the middle, progressives, saying, no. Normal people aren't smart enough to vote. They're not smart enough to vote on human rights. They're not smart enough to vote on the economy. And they're not smart enough to vote on climate change. So you hear this sort of middle class fascism here, and it's very much an echo of the 1930s because you get those two. When those two, when that working class thuggery comes to get, I'm going to cut that. I didn't mean to say that. Good. When that sort of working class anger comes forward, based on this idea of action, and when it's married to a certain middle class frustration with democracy, you get that. But then you get people on the left as well, and as Marx said, a dictatorship of the proletariat. So I mean, I do wonder, and I'm going to ask you an honest question because people might say, "Oh, here he goes, Red's under the bed." But I hear, when I hear people saying, "Well, show me a socialist society," and they show me a society, and say, "Okay, that society is very interesting." Because there's only one political party. There are trade unions, but they're not trade unions like we are because they're under control of the party. There are elections, but no one has ever lost an election. So you can understand why, in terms of you talk about democracy, but some people might say, now other people can say, well, democracy doesn't always mean a parliament and representative democracy. But every time we've tried to evolve away from that democracy, we've ended up with no democracy whatsoever.
I'll definitely answer that, but before I do, I'd also say, if you look at Britain and Ireland, for the last more or less 100 years, you had two parties run the state, Tories, Labour, Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael. So, that's not much of an option in those sort of battle, if you will.
Well, they did. In terms of the Republic of Ireland, those two parties, they won free and fair elections.
Well, I would also say there's not much difference between them, and they're collapsing. But anyway, just as a side point, I mean, I suppose the point I would make is that there's no like model state that we would say this is everything that can be done. You know, there's some examples in the sort of Scandinavian countries where they're doing sort of childcare stuff well, and that's good. Cuba is not the model, but it's certainly a state which has done a lot of amazing things under an embargo. Do you know what I mean? Under economic embargo that's prevented, you know.
And if we were in Cuba, we would not be having this conversation now. We couldn't have this conversation now.
Well, again, like I'm not for,
and I'm a member of a trade union, which
listen,
would also not be tolerated.
I've supported protests against the Cuban sort of state from below. You know, left wing people in Cuba, former members of the Revolutionary Parade, who've campaigned against the state, but also at the same time said that, you know, the embargo on the US is criminal. So both things can be the same, can be true at the same time. So no model as such, but also I think what you have to understand is for every attempt to create either a new society in terms of socialism or a, you know, more progressive state. Look at Allende, who was, you know, not a Marxist, he was a social democrat. What happened is you get crushed. You get crushed by primarily the US, Britain, and other countries as well. So I think that has to be factored in the scenario. But the threat of intervention, either direct military or economic warfare by the Western countries because they don't like their interests being challenged. So I think that has to be part of it. But also I think it's important to say that it's up to us to shape what socialism, what Ireland, what the future looks like. And we're proposing one that's based on democracy, human rights, tackling wealth inequality. And I think most people, when you move away from those scare words and the red baiting and the McCarthyism, I think most people can be sensibly won around that.